Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Here at Stockholm on day 2 of Stockholm+50, the international meeting which celebrates 50 years since the first Environment and Development meeting in Stockholm in 1972, and is exploring new ways to break through the challenge of how we have sustainable growth on a planet which is interconnected between its systems of climate, nature, the need to tackle the pollution that we've created, and a place where everyone can live well within their planetary boundaries. My name is Dominic Warre. I'm a senior advisor to the CEO at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm delighted to be joined here with Eric Usher, who is the head of the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. Thanks for joining us, Eric.
My pleasure, Dominic.
We're here to discuss a call for enhanced collaboration to explore the potential for a new global corporate accountability and transparency mechanism. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for those of you who are involved in the climate action agenda, let's say since perhaps Paris in 2015, through to the Glasgow COP last year, you will have undoubtedly have noticed there's just the mobilization of effort that has come through from businesses, from innovators, from technologies, and from finance, and not least driven on that financial side by the great work of the UNEP Finance Initiative. And we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, Eric. But the absolute kind of change from, if we stretch back to maybe 2009 and that Copenhagen COP, where it was very much a kind of closed governmental discussion, to now the economy, the financial sector is really moving fast to do what it can to shape this agenda. That's the world that we are living in, even with the challenges around the war in Ukraine and inflation rising and energy and food issues. There is a resolution, a determination among many that we cannot lose sight of that net zero target by 2030, not least because of the science that the IPCC have set out, a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. It is urgent, and it is now to do it. And the business and financial community have mobilized like we've never seen before, perhaps in the history of trying to transform key parts of the global economy. It's not everything, but it is a systems change on its way. What was fascinating about Stockholm+50 and the invitation from the Secretariat in Sweden to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, in close cooperation with our friends at the Stockholm Environment Institute and with our friends at the United Nations Environment Programme, the invitation was, okay, so can we explore what that business mobilization looks like across 5 or 6 global value chains? Things like construction and the built environment, or mobility, or fashion, or food and agriculture, things which really drive aspects of the global economy, create wealth and opportunity, but do have an impact on climate change and on nature destruction and on pollution and on rising levels of inequality. What would those companies and business alliances be telling us about the great examples they are showing, but the areas where they're getting stuck, where there are common roadblocks starting to appear, because really for transformative change, there become policy levers that need to be pulled. Things to do with infrastructure investment, things to do with common definitions, things to do with harmonization. That's what the Stockholm Action Agenda created. It identified 3 key areas where a new kind of architecture between policymakers, the international community, and informed business could undo some of these roadblocks. One was around circularity. To move to a circular economy at the speed and transformation that is required, whether it's a fashion, electronics, built environment, construction, mobility, common roadblocks are starting to emerge around definitions, around standards, and around being able to transport secondary materials across boundaries. And so could there be a kind of a protocol that the international community, informed by those who are experiencing these roadblocks, imagine and work on and develop into practice, such that it really provides the value add, including to developing and emerging economies as much as not. That was one idea. Another idea was around skills and investment in capacity. Not only the skills and investment in capacity for people who will be moving from the old economy to the new economy, from what people sometimes say is brown to green economy, but also within the corporate community itself, the ability to understand within the board and within different business lines how quickly the sustainability agenda is changing and what new fiduciary responsibilities are required to have the capability to work outside of the enterprise, along value chains and in collaboration, and to stimulate the investment in SMEs and micro enterprises and entrepreneurs to build that new economy of tomorrow. That was the second area. And again, for those of you who know the international system very well, friends in UNIDO, friends in UNEP, friends in the International Labour Organization, that kind of coming together of those programs with that sprint to 2030. The third area is something that I'm really, really excited to talk about here, and particularly to get your insights on the work that you've been doing, Eric, within the Finance Initiative, and that is this corporate accountability and transparency framework. Put very simply, if we take the climate agenda and we recognize that there's this incredible movement now of champion businesses and the financial sector who are moving fast to make commitments and try to shift the economy towards net zero, if you or I were to go on the internet and say, okay, can someone show me a nice dashboard that says, okay, well, how are we doing? How are we doing if we add up all of those business commitments against what we are saying is the science that is telling us to move fast, or in different sectors, or in different regions? It's very hard to find that composite information. There's lots and lots of bits and pieces, but it's hard to put it together. It's difficult to measure apples to apples and see how we are getting on. We have a global stock take at the Climate COP in 2023, and the idea, the emergence of actually being able to take stock with such an accountability and transparency framework, particularly for business and corporate commitments, will be very, very useful indeed. And fascinating that the 70 or so businesses and business associations who are part of the Stockholm Action Agenda said that would be a great idea, because for those who are moving fast, there's innovation, there's opportunity, but also an element of risk. And so it's very good to be shown that these are the ones who are moving, because then questions can be asked about not only how fast are you moving, but where are the others? That's the transparency. For those in society or policy making outside of the business community, the accountability is, are you doing what you said you would do? So there's a very exciting development, and we're delighted to launch the process now of engaging in dialogue with key stakeholders to make that come alive over the next several months. And why it's such a privilege to have you, Eric, here is because I'm sure in your head right now you're thinking, yeah, I recognize some of this stuff, because you've been working on this with the financial community for some time. It's not easy, but what you've done is tremendous work in the Finance Initiative at UNEP, and be keen to get kind of your reflections on how you see this agenda and the need and the potential for these transparency and accountability mechanisms to help show how the corporate business and potentially even the financial community is delivering against what it said it was going to do. Eric, over to you, sir.
Well, thanks very much, Dominic. And I think if we think back 50 years, one of the fundamental changes is the relationship and the expectations between the public sector and the private sector. And if we, in a somewhat simplistic way, think of 1972 and even 1992, I would say, the expectation is governments came together to put in place frameworks that everybody would wait to be told what those frameworks were, and then they would act. And if there was a financial problem, they would put together a fund, public fund, to finance changes that need to be done. Obviously, the evolution in 50 years has completely changed. Governments don't have the resources any longer, but I think more importantly, they understand the relationship between public and private. We would call it is more of a dance, which basically means it's not about governments fully regulating as the first step and the private sector complying with those regulations. It's about a ratcheting up of messaging, because regulating markets is very difficult. The financial markets, technology, every market is complicated. And so we need a good, healthy relationship between the actors who are doing the economic activity and the regulators who are meant to oversee or provide the framework in which they operate. And if we talk about the climate challenge, and take the example of climate risk disclosures, based on the TCFD, the Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, we would see that as an example of where it's played out quite well, where the governments under the G20, under the French presidency at the time of the Paris COP, established a task force of private sector representatives who came up with a set of recommendations on how you should disclose on climate risks on your balance sheet as a corporate, as a financial actor. But they didn't actually give the details of how do you do that. And the big challenge is most of the analysis has to be forward-looking. No longer can you see what failed in the past, so we shouldn't do it again. We have to be predictive. The industries we finance, agriculture, steel and cement, how are those going to change, and how's that going to change the risks and the opportunities of the clients that we're operating with? So within the TCFD, it was given to the private sector to start disclosing. The expectation was there, but voluntarily. And we saw quite a healthy uptake. And so the breadth of disclosures got going over a number of years quite well. Most large corporates disclose today. But the depth of the disclosures were kind of wanting. The quality wasn't sufficient. The comparability wasn't there. And so that's when regulators have started to ratchet, starting with New Zealand and then EU and UK and even the SEC in the US and in various emerging markets. They are starting to put expectations around what those disclosures should look like. So the private sector led voluntarily, but then the public sector is ratcheting up with them. And all of this public-private relationship and the role of voluntary action becomes critical. And I think to the discussions of an accountability framework, because as we talk about, well, let's say ESG today, this every day in the newspapers we read another story, another concern about how ESG isn't working here, isn't working there, or the scale of ESG uptake there. And all of that boils down to obviously is having credibility within these corporate frameworks that can provide confidence for industry to voluntarily start to shift in a direction to inform governments and for governments to figure out is something needed on the regulatory front, or in some cases maybe it's not. Within climate, we have the net zero movement. Net zero is very interesting for many reasons. One is because we know that fiduciary duties are incredibly important within the private sector, within the financial sector. It's very hard to do things that break your fiduciary duties, so your duties to your beneficiaries. And so that fiduciary duties have traditionally created a very short-term focus. So your financially material issues were those which very concretely you could say is going to affect your balance sheet in the few years to come. And yet net zero by 2050 is 30 years out, and we've seen this huge mobilization. And begs the question is, how can, and that's not a financial objective, it's an environmental objective to stabilize the client, and yet we're seeing corporates and the financial sector saying we need to align. And I think the big change we're seeing now is the notion is there are issues related to stakeholder capitalism, which a lot through intangible assets, a lot of, if it's reputation risk or otherwise, there's a realization that you cannot push these issues aside, that essentially you need to engage in them. And then there's the question of how do you engage? We have 500 years of history of developing accounting standards. They're very sophisticated financial accounting, how you report to the markets. If you want to be a purpose-driven organization, and we're hearing now more and more the need, we have the Business Roundtable in the U.S., we have various, basically trying to push Friedman aside. You can't really talk about purpose without talking about impact. And if you talk about impact, you need to start understanding not as what is the couple good green things you do at the margins. We issued a green bond. We invested in renewable energy project, but it's the rest of the business. And so impact is something that has to be done holistically. If you want to define purpose, you essentially define the impact you want to have. And so if we talk in the example of climate, it's not about doing a couple low carbon or climate resilient projects or transactions. It's about, are we aligning with a societal priority, which is stabilizing climate emissions, so getting to net zero. Can we align with the transition, as you say, 45% reduction by 2030? It's the whole of portfolio approach. We're seeing a lot of mobilization, but accountability is going to be key. Integrity. And we're seeing it now at all levels. There's a lot of good developments that are happening, but as I talk about the news around ESG, it's still, we're in the pressure cooker stage. If we don't get it right, it'll be brushed off as greenwashing. If we get it right, we can create a really efficient relationship between the voluntarism of the corporate sector and the role of regulators to true up and essentially create a cycle of ambition that can take us to get not only to stabilizing climate emissions, but then, as you said, nature. How do we get to impact positive nature preservation, circularity, and then the wide raft of social issues. all of this really requires frameworks. It requires saying, what are we going to align with? What's the compass that we're directing towards? And what's the accountability, the frameworks that we need to actually show that how we're moving in that direction?
Eric, that's brilliant. That's so insightful. Credibility, confidence, purpose, impact, accountability. I mean, these are sort of words that it's almost like the next step in this journey. Having had like the brilliant effort to kind of mobilize from the financial community and then from the business community, the climate champions under the Marrakesh Partnership did an amazing job. But now, credibility, confidence, purpose, and impact, and the need to somehow show to people who are kind of, I want this to work. I want our systems to be responding in the way that you're saying. But how do I know? Where can I go and check? And what gives me confidence? Because it has to be something that is universal and owned and run very much by the kind of United Nations organizations that you represent, so that people have trust in the information. In the financial sector, given all that you've known, it's been fascinating to see how the mobilization of effort and commitment that you and many others have helped inspire, how that has actually shifted the business community as well, because the signals from the market, as much as from the consumer, are pretty interesting and pretty strong. As well as the opportunity space, I guess it's not an easy thing to do, right? To kind of build these sorts of not only movements, but also these frameworks for transparency.
I think one of the most complicated aspects, and we heard this in a meeting this morning, it's all about the supply chain or the value chain. And the reality is cleaning up your business is often much easier than understanding the scope 3, or essentially the impact of your suppliers and your customers and your clients. And this also extends from the corporate to the financial actor. If we talk about banks, how they're going to decarbonize their balance sheets, the main effort will be their engagements with their clients. It's not so simple about we will finance this and we won't finance that in terms of the portfolio. It's about working with clients to say, what are you doing to navigate this transition? Where do you need CapEx to actually do that? Or if you're a laggard, we're worried and we think you're at risk, you're a credit risk because you're way behind the pack, and we believe you're going to be regulated out, you're going to be technology innovated out. So it's really about the relationship between the actors in the value chain. And once again, if you need frameworks to be able to be measurable, the dashboards you talk about, we need a global dashboard. We need every corporate leader needs his dashboard. And his dashboard today is too limited, what's there, as we know. Financial metrics, risk metrics. What we need is the impact alignment metrics to sit alongside.
Yes. The analog is so interesting, the kind of clients and the banking community, the upstream suppliers and the scope and the enterprise for the scope 3. Because quite quickly this is a kind of behavioral change in a sort of new form of collaboration, not just within the enterprise or within the bank, but across a whole range of clients or across a whole range of suppliers. It's kind of like a new muscle that is required within the corporate community. It takes us, it's accountability, but not necessarily in a kind of compliance manner only. It's sort of, what is it that we're going to do to help change the ecosystem that we are in? And how can I show that ecosystem is being changed? We had some great colleagues from Natura and Stora Enso earlier, and they were talking exactly along these lines about actually working with their suppliers upstream and customers downstream, so that this accountability starts to shift an ecosystem rather than just sort of compliance management type of approach within an enterprise. Is that something that's sort of happening in the financial sector?
Absolutely. And maybe I can give you the example of what the banks have been doing. So because 15 years ago, we established the Principle of Responsible Investment. It's been very successful in terms of creating the foundations of ESG as a risk to be managed. It's very mainstreamed it, but it's focused mostly on risk. We have a framework for insurance, which is somewhat similar, but it was 2 years ago, 2019, with the Secretary General, where we launched these principles for responsible banking. It's totally different. It's post-2015 as a framework, which means the expectation is you already have the risk management systems in place. Okay. It's not about risk management. It's about impact and alignment. And so what the banks, and today we're coming up to nearly 50% of global banking assets signed on, very global. And a bank signatory, what they need to do, and I'll explain this because I think there are parallels here. First step is they commit to install within their operations systems to assess impact across all lines of business. So to understand when they're financing corporates in the steel industry, in the automotive industry, what are the impacts of what they're financing? As we know in the past, when you talk about impacts, it's like, oh, how much paper consumption, how much electricity consumption. Now, banks don't consume a lot of paper, but their clients create a lot of emissions, or they have other impacts. So it's about putting in place systems to monitor impact. That's step one. Step two is they're required to prioritize impacts and to publish what they believe are the most significant impact areas that they have, positive and negative. So now climate has, for most of the banks, been prioritized in the number 1 or 2, but essentially over time they're meant to be constantly publishing what they believe the biggest impact that they are creating, positive and negative, and that they need to start setting targets to actually make improvements in those impact areas. So the most obvious one is in the climate area, they've set this net zero, and we have this sub-alliance of banks who say, okay, we're going to get to zero emissions 2050, intermediate targets 2030, along the line of the, based on the science, 45% reduction based on IPCC, etc. Accountability is important in this. So the next step is they need to report annually. It has to be third-party verified. Right. So that's new. And systems to put in place, how do you do that? Because what they're verifying is impact measures, priorities, setting targets. So it's quite different from the risk metrics, which is historically what they've been doing. And then the last dimension of it is civil society plays an important role. There's a civil society advisory body. And as you probably know, the relationship between banks and civil society has not always been an easy one. But they do value that civil society can help them in terms of identifying issues, to set priorities over time. And so it's a framework that allows banks to say, this dashboard, to say where are the big issues in our markets that we want to be dealing with it. Is it gender? Is it resource efficiency, climate, etc.? And what are the metrics that we can use to measure, and how do we need to publish to the markets to be credible in what they're doing? That sort of approach, I think there are some versions of that, but we haven't seen ones that are very, very similar within other markets. The parallel in climate, of course, is if you're doing net zero, you start to ask the companies you're investing in or you're financing for their transition plans, much like regulators are starting to ask for it. So that's the start of the dialogue. But that dialogue doesn't only need to be about climate. Of course, there are the many other issues, and it's about getting that dashboard in place, and then the frameworks that can provide the credibility of essentially the data that needs to be flowing back and forth to show that, we're not only measuring the risks and returns, we're also measuring the impacts, and we've got business targets for how we want to change that impact through the whole organization over time.
Super insightful. So the principles of responsible banking, which you were referring to, have been down this path, and you created that kind of process and that stepwise. And if we're kind of thinking maybe shifting along the value chain to some of the let's say real economy players, where we're sensing interest to explore, well, what would that dashboard look like for us as we made these commitments? It sounds like and it's the good news about this collaboration. We can maybe draw and be inspired by some of the work and findings that you've done, and even perhaps there's a cross-learning between folks, because these are the clients, I suppose, Absolutely. Of the banks. So we start to join up, Absolutely. If you like, that kind of change process in the ecosystem, which is super interesting. Eric, first of all, just thank you for all the great work that you've done and the team has done over the years on the financing side. And I hope that you can sense how that's actually inspiring some movement, in other parts of the economy. This idea of a kind of corporate accountability framework was launched as part of the business manifesto by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a business manifesto for climate recovery at the Glasgow COP. The Stockholm+50 moment with the Stockholm Action Agenda has been a brilliant innovation to help explore that further, see how it could work, make sure it doesn't get cooked in isolation, but draw on the lessons and learnings from UNEP and from other organizations who've been looking at this. But there's something in this in terms of some dialogues and steps ahead, perhaps as we look towards the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, or even, as I mentioned earlier, the Global Stocktake COP. Also in the context of what we're all hearing, given the world that we live in, is that we want new forms of multilateral cooperation which can help us all get the job done. Because the world is so complicated and fragile at the moment that if we can lean in with some confidence and energy on things like a global corporate accountability framework for showing how the progress is being made, it will give us all confidence and being inspired by what the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative has been a trailblazer in. So thank you, Eric, and thank you very much here in Stockholm for watching, and thanks for listening to this online. We're delighted to be launching the process to build this global corporate accountability framework as part of the Stockholm Action Agenda outcomes. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, everyone. With that, we'll close the presentation. Thank you.